Welcome back to our news bulletin. We start with the Indian government, which has charged the occupied Kashmir's politician Shah Faisal under the controversial Public Safety Act. Last week, the occupied valley's former chief ministers Mehbooba Mufti and Umar Abdullah were also arrested under the stringent law. Under the law, the Indian government can keep a person in custody for up to 2 years without a trial. Faisal was detained in August last year after his remarks against Delhi's annexation of Jammu and Kashmir. Last year, Faisal formed Jammu and Kashmir People's Movement Party after resigning from Indian Administrative Service. The valley is reeling under Indian curfew and clampdown for the last 195 days. Pakistan has summoned Indian diplomat from the High Commission to register Islamabad's strong protest against border ceasefire violations. Yesterday, a 13-year-old girl was wounded in an unprovoked Indian firing in Nezapur and Rajpuri sectors along the line of control. In a statement, Foreign Office said, deliberate targeting of civilian population by India is deplorable and against humanitarian laws. It said India's ceasefire violations are a threat to regional peace and security and may lead to a strategic miscalculation. Pakistan has time and again asked India to respect the 2003 ceasefire agreement, but ceasefire violations by Indian forces continue unabated. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres will arrive in Pakistan on a 4-day maiden visit tomorrow. Guterres is scheduled to chair the international conference on 40 years of hosting Afghan refugees in Pakistan. In a statement, Pakistan's Foreign Office said Guterres will meet Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan. It said Islamabad will apprise Guterres on Pakistan's perspective on all aspects of Indian-occupied Kashmir's dispute. The office said the Secretary General will pay a visit to Lahore and also travel to Gurdwara Kartarpur Sahib. It said Guterres' participation in the conference is a recognition of Pakistan's exemplary resolve in hosting Afghan refugees for the past 4 decades. The US has imposed sanctions on Sri Lanka's army chief for alleged human rights abuses. Lieutenant General Shavindra Silva has been accused of committing extrajudicial killings in 2009 during the country's civil war. In a statement, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the allegations against Silva are serious and credible. He said Silva's human rights violations had been documented by the UN and other organizations. The sanctions will prevent the army chief and members of his family from entering the US. Silva is credited with leading the decisive fight against Tamil Tiger rebels in the country's long civil war, which ended in 2009. The United Nations says it is optimistic on the peace talks between the US and the Taliban, calling them a step forward toward ending the Afghan war. In a press briefing, the UN spokesperson Stéphane Dujarric said the body is closely following the Doha talks. Dujarric said the organization's office in Kabul has been kept up to date. He said the ongoing talks are important in opening a way for intra-Afghan peace talks. His statement comes a day before UN Chief Antonio Guterres' visit to Pakistan. During his stay, Guterres will chair a conference on Afghan refugees and meet Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan and other top leadership. The United Nations has called on Syria, Turkey, and Russia to take steps towards de-escalation of the situation in Idlib. UN General Secretary spokesperson Stéphane Dujarric says a ceasefire is necessary to ensure humanitarian access to the region. Dujarric said the UN wants the conflicting parties in Syria to end violence and fighting. The statement comes after Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan accused the Russian and Syrian forces of targeting civilians in the Idlib. He said Ankara will not tolerate any further violations of the truce in Syria. Tensions are high in the region after clashes between Turkish and Russia-backed Syrian forces in Idlib. In its latest report on Syrian refugees, the UN head of humanitarian affairs says 20,000 people have fled Idlib in the last 2 days. UN official Mark Lowcock says more people have fled the country in the last 10 weeks than at any other time in the 9-year conflict. Watch more in this report.
As they move, people check the sky and wonder if they're about to be bombed. In the bone-crushing cold, Syrian refugees travel in open trucks or on foot, day and night. They're heading to the Turkish border.
We fled 5 days ago from the western province of Anjara near Aleppo. We escaped the airstrikes and shelling. The journey was very difficult. It was cold, we couldn't find a car, and we kept walking until we found a car to take us here.
Most camps are full. Many sleep in the open, in fields where they struggle to keep warm in the harsh winter conditions.
We didn't have any money. We kept looking around but couldn't find a car, and we were surrounded by airstrikes. We are now here in a camp near Afrin, staying in a tent just to get by. The past 3 days have been cold on the road and on the streets.
In Syria's official population of 17 million, 5.5 million people are living as refugees in neighbouring countries. 6 million others have been uprooted within their country. More than 800,000 Syrians have fled since December 1st, and the exodus is expected to continue.
Yemen's Houthi rebel group has claimed to shoot down a Tornado fighter jet belonging to the government coalition. In a statement, Houthi spokesperson said the group targeted the jet with an advanced air-to-ground missile in Al Jawf Governorate. Coalition forces have not yet made any statement over the claim. Yemen has been entangled in violence and chaos since 2014 after Houthi rebels overran much of the country, including the capital Sana'a. UN says tens of thousands of Yemenis have been killed since then, while another 14 million are at risk of starvation. Moving on to China, where 143 people have died in the last 24 hours from the new coronavirus, which brings the death toll to 1,523. The National Health Commission says 2,641 more people are now known to be infected. This brings the death toll to over 66,000 across the country. More in this report.
With no sign of the outbreak ending, people are dying in hundreds every day, and it's spreading. Egypt has confirmed a coronavirus case, the first in Africa. In China, to contain the virus, Beijing has instructed people entering the city to go into quarantine for 14 days or risk punishment. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China will do everything it can to end the outbreak.
每个人都承担的责任。
In this country with 1.4 billion Chinese people, we are doing everything we can, leaving no stone unturned to contain this epidemic. This would be a great challenge to any country, to any leader worldwide. But China has done it. We cannot rule out the possibility that there are some challenges to China. However, we must see that the majority of countries have expressed the appreciation of what China has been doing.
在共同参与的。
The World Health Organization says it will open an investigation into the coronavirus outbreak in China this weekend. The main focus will be how COVID-19, as it's called, is spreading and the severity of the disease.
I'm glad to say that the WHO-led joint mission with China on COVID-19 is moving forward. We expect the full team to touch down over the weekend. The mission consists of 12 international and WHO experts and a similar number of national expert counterparts from China.
The global health body is advising Japan not to go ahead with this year's Olympic Games in Tokyo. Japan is one of the most affected countries outside of China.
In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has vowed to repay the trust of voters by improving infrastructure, reducing crime and building more hospitals. Welcoming his new cabinet in London, Johnson said the new cabinet should focus on delivering Tory election promises. He said the new ministers must get on with their basic work of improving the livelihoods of the British people. The Prime Minister said the ministers should spread the economic opportunity more widely across the country. The reshuffle is one of the major developments in the government following Britain's exit from the EU. The Munich Security Conference, often regarded as the Davos of security and foreign policy issues, is underway. Organizers say this year's theme of Westlessness points to continued unease about the identity and purpose of the West. This report will now tell you more.
"35 heads of state are among more than 500 politicians, officials, and spies attending the three-day security summit in Munich. Speaking at the conference, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called for countries to work together to cope with the crisis facing the world in 2020. Trudeau said a growing lack of trust in leaders is causing citizens to fall for populist movements. Trudeau also cautioned against the rise in authoritarianism.
Basic freedoms are being suppressed, and authoritarian leaders are being emboldened. Political anxieties are adding turbulence to a world that is already facing unprecedented change. The global balance of power is shifting, with new powers rapidly rising and others becoming more assertive in their regions.
Germany's President Frank-Walter Steinmeier accused the US, China, and Russia of stoking global mistrust. He deplored the three big powers' approach to global affairs and, without naming Trump, took issue with his promise to make America great again.
Russia, rightly or not, feeling offended and estranged, has not only annexed the Crimean Peninsula regardless of international law, it has made military force and the violent shifting of borders on the European continent the means of politics once again. Insecurity, unpredictability, confrontation, loss of trust are the consequences.
US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi warned of what she called Huawei's insidious aggression. Pelosi called for an international effort to build something about freedom of information.
If you want to build a collective conscience of values and respect for human rights and the rest, don't go near Huawei. And instead, let's internationalize, build something together that will be about freedom of information.
As always happens at such events, on top of public sessions and speeches, many leaders meet on the sidelines of the conference, which ends tomorrow.
We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. Foreign ministers from world powers will gather in Munich tomorrow to discuss the implementation of the Libya ceasefire and arms embargo. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas welcomed the new momentum towards a lasting ceasefire in Libya. Maas said the UN Security Council decision has endorsed the outcome of the Berlin conference after long and difficult negotiations. He said last week the military committees of the conflict parties had their first direct negotiations on a ceasefire. The foreign minister said the meeting will discuss the monitoring mechanisms and implementation of the conclusions of Berlin conference. Foreign ministers from the US, Russia, Turkey, Italy, France, and other regional actors are expected to take part in the meeting. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky have discussed the release of Ukrainian citizens detained in Russia and other parts. Speaking over the phone, they also discussed preparations for the next meeting of the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France in the so-called Normandy format. Relations between Kiev and Moscow collapsed after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Moscow supports separatist fighters in the Donbas region in a war that has killed more than 13,000 people. Serbia and Kosovo have signed a deal to restore a railway link between the two Balkan rivals after a two-decade interval. The agreement was signed at the Munich Security Conference in the presence of Serbian and Kosovar presidents. The deal comes after the two sides signed an accord last month to resume commercial flights after a two-decade interval. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić said it was a move to stabilize the region for the next decade. Kosovo President Hashim Thaçi said the entire region needs this deal. Kosovo has been recognized by over 110 countries, including the US, but not by Serbia, Russia, and China. Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro has threatened to arrest the US-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido. Speaking to international press in Caracas, Maduro said the day will come when Guaido will pay for his crimes. Maduro accused Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro of being behind terrorist threats. He criticized Spain for what he called a smear campaign against Venezuela. Earlier this week, officials allowed Guaido back into the country from a tour of the US and Europe despite a travel ban. Maduro said Venezuela's justice system will decide when Guaido should be imprisoned.
The day the courts of the Republic give the order to detain Mr. Juan Guaido for all the crimes he has committed, that day he will go to jail. That is a certainty. That day has not arrived, but it will.
President Maduro said his decision to allow transactions in dollars was a result of the U.S. economic war and sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. Venezuela is in its sixth year of recession, marked by hyperinflation, food shortages, and the immigration of millions. Now moving on to Haiti, where at least 15 children have died in a fire that swept through an orphanage outside the capital city of Port-au-Prince. Health workers say 7 of the victims were toddlers and the rest were aged 10 or 11. The orphanage was using candles for lighting because of problems with its generator and inverter. There was no immediate explanation for the accident. 40 people, including soldiers, have been killed in a spate of attacks in central Mali. Government officials say 31 civilians have died in inter-ethnic violence in the village of Ogosagu. Authorities say 30 heavily armed men entered Ogosagu, burning houses and looting livestock. They said the attackers arrived only hours after government troops left the area. Elsewhere in the country, an ambush killed 9 soldiers in the village of Bentia in Gao. The army said 4 others were injured without saying who carried out the attack. Central Mali has been gripped by ethnic violence since a militant revolt and brief takeover in 2012. The US has announced an increase in tariffs on Airbus planes imported from Europe to 15% beginning from March 18th. This United States Trade Representative's announcement comes days after President Donald Trump said a trade deal with the European Union will be re-evaluated. The duties have been at 10% since last October, when Washington hit $7.5 billion in European products with tariffs. Airbus says Washington's decision will hit US airlines, which are already facing difficulties. The European plane maker said it will continue discussions with its US customers to ease the effects of tariffs as far as possible. Industry executives in Europe and the US are waiting on new announcements from trade authorities amid rising economic tensions. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.